Hello, I'm Kevin Benedict, Senior Vice President of Solution Strategy at Regalix, and I want to thank you for joining us today. This is an exciting series. This is part of the CIO WaterCooler's IT Leadership Series, and I'm just thrilled to welcome my guest today, David Carvalho, and he is with Naoris, and he's the founder. So thank you for joining us today, David.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this another series of the CIO WaterCooler. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, Naoris is a startup. Now, you just recently left a very giant company where you're CISO, and that was OCS, and you left that to join Naoris or to found Naoris. Talk to us about what motivated that departure and for you to get that entrepreneur bug.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. Actually, that was a recent situation. So I left OCS Group, where I was as you said, the CISO, the global CISO there. I have been actually working with a number of colleagues and friends on this project called Naoris for about 3 years now. And we have achieved a level of maturity where it was, we actually wanted to bring it either to market directly to immediate clients to actually test in real critical environments, or to go ahead and do a token sale around what is usual in this space for crypto projects, since we are using a blockchain based environment as our backbone. That was basically what spurred that decision. From the entrepreneurial perspective, which I guess is the second part of your question, it's really about the fact that I have been involved in the area of cybersecurity for quite a while, and making decisions at that very high level, at that board level, around what technologies should the companies bring in. And over time, I have seen threats not really changing. If anything, they have become more prolific and more common. Over time, I thought, since I am involved in other areas of technology, it would make sense to leverage this different approach to actually try to change the status quo around something that has been pretty much repetitive historically.
So, David, you're combining two of the hottest kind of environments, cybersecurity with blockchain. Talk to us about what that relationship is and why those two go so well together.
Yeah, actually, it's not the most trivial of marriages. The blockchain was initially made for things that are a bit more, how can I say, easier to manage. So, for example, normal monetary transactions, for example, with Bitcoin, so transactions of tokens of value or attributed value there in a distributed validation format. But you can actually use the blockchain, and it has been seen in the last years with many technologies, mainly with Ethereum, that you can actually leverage these to build what's called smart contracts, and not just do transactions of, in this case, monetary value, and take away a bunch of intermediaries while you are at it, and bring a lot of more trust into the environment, but you can actually add code and logic into it. And that actually opens the doors to more complex endeavors and traditionally quite hard to manage, like cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is a space that, as you mentioned, it's a hot space. It's not as recent as the cryptocurrency or the crypto space, or the blockchain space, to speak more clearly, because that's what really, for me, is the most interesting part about crypto. But I think both of them come very well together, because you basically transform what was traditionally a very hard hard to prove truth environment. So it was very hard to prove something on a very siloed, traditionally, environments that tend to be cybersecurity in very complex networks. And suddenly you have the opportunity to create a distributed consensus, kind of like an ecosystem where different machines and different environments come actually into consensus around certain truths, in this case regarding cybersecurity-based domains.
So are you using blockchain in this environment? Are you using it as a way of authenticating, who people are? So am I actually doing business? Do I want to receive an invoice? Do I want to send a purchase order? Is that the kind of thing you're doing? You're using it for authenticity purposes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're actually doing something like that, but we're taking it a step further. So there are a number of fintech companies and other companies that actually are doing several utility-based systems based on the blockchain or using blockchain-based systems that would be more related to what you just mentioned. But actually, we are targeting kind of like a harder space. So we are targeting the hard to defend spaces. So, spaces that tend to be extremely security conscious. So from both from an access control perspective, who did what, when, how, etc., and around control, all the way to environments that are hard to defend. Mainly, nation state-based infrastructure or critical infrastructure, national regulated infrastructure or businesses, all the way to things that are a lot more industrial. So the area of actually identity and access management and making sure that a certain thing is correct and is from the person that they say it is and they are, and it can be validated across the way. That's part of what we do, but we are going deeper. We're going into more, into network security, into cloud security, into data protection environments like DLP, by using a distributed consensus algorithm that was not really possible to be leveraged before due to the lack of this technology. Of course, the cryptocurrency helps because it enables us to create an amount of incentive for these ecosystems, just like in society. You have incentive in the form of salaries and other things.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, you have incentive in the form of cryptocurrency actually being delivered to the network for their work for their work of protecting the rest of the network.
So, David, you've used the term consensus several times in our conversation here. Talk to us about the value of consensus here, because I know if you look at cybersecurity on its own, oftentimes you're going to have a technology that's trying to defend against all kinds of attacks, and a lot of those defense mechanisms, although there's shared information among different security firms and forums in which to track these kinds of attacks, it's still your technology against the world. But in a consensus environment, it's not just your technology, it's a lot of different technology and systems cooperating. Walk us through that. What does that look like?
Yeah, you said that very well. You're absolutely right. So in the same way that, for example, the Bitcoin ecosystem actually ends up verifying recursively all transactions ever made, pretty much doing the job that banks do in automating the whole environment. I wouldn't say probably in the most efficient manner, but it does, it has done a good job of it. The same way that happens in our environment, we basically have a security ecosystem per se, where not just the machines that live within your environment that are basically turned into nodes of the blockchain that can end up verifying transactions or not. In other environments that are also potentially connected to yours. So it would be networks that would be connected to yours, or either networks that would be connected through the internet to yours, end up validating pretty much in a kind of like from a random perspective. That's to mitigate several attacks to the blockchain itself, so that the attackers don't know exactly which environment is going to the next validation, or which cluster is going to the next validation cluster of environments. So they can't really subvert that. So these environments that are picked at random, that are made secure through the blockchain and verified secure through the principles and the rules that we have set up within the blockchain ecosystems that we are using, they come up, and as you said, they come up with a consensus that is a distributed consensus that is very democratic and is very hard to, how can I say, subvert. So if one of these environments actually wants to make a cryptographic proof that is not correct, these will come up as incorrect to the others, and they will not come up with the same conclusion. So the consensus on that side would be kind of like broken. It would be won by the majority, pretty much kind of like in a democratic system. If you want to look at that in traditional environments, as you mentioned, in cybersecurity, usually you have individual machines deciding about what's going on. So if a machine is breached or there's a user that actually subverts his access and escalates his privileges and does things that he shouldn't do, all he has to do is turn off certain log managers or maybe delete some logs, and maybe nothing will be seen. And it's actually quite hard to validate that happened, both in time and cryptographically, from a forensics perspective as well. So by having a consensus mechanism that is time frame based with a lot of metadata associated with all these signals, you can actually have consensus about what's good over time and when good became bad over time. So that gives you, how can I say, that truth becomes known universally. So there is no disputing it in a way.
Oh, very good. Although, truth seems always to be disputed in this climate that we all find ourselves in today.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes.
The whole thing, yes.
So yesterday, it was reported that one of the senior people, I think it was the CTO of VMware, was talking about blockchain, and he used some very strong language. He said, "I believe blockchain as it is today is in fact immoral because it uses far too much energy to do a simple transaction." What's your response to that in a blockchain environment?
So that's a very good, even though an aggressive argument, it's a very good argument. And it's a good question too. So this is quite a non-consensual space. And speaking about consensus, to tell the truth, there are different ways of achieving consensus in a blockchain, and that comes through different kinds of mining or verification of transactions. In this case, he's talking about the more, how can I say, traditional approach to doing consensus, which is what you have usually in the Bitcoin environment, blockchain, and other blockchains that tend to be older. You end up having what's called proof of work consensus, and that comes from a high level. It comes from pretty much a war against the laws of thermodynamics. So the harder you fight, the harder the difficulty is for you to actually find the new coins and to prove to do new validations. And of course, yes, that's almost immoral because it escalated to a point where you have a blockchain using more electricity than some people claim Spain. So that's that cannot continue as I see it, and it's personally my opinion. But there are many people that believe that's how it should be. Personally, I think that there are other consensus mechanisms that work a lot better, and I think that his affirmation comes from a standpoint that is quite common. Most people are not really up to date with what is happening on the blockchain. Things are evolving pretty much by the week, if not by the day, and there are consensus mechanisms appearing or algorithms appearing from time to time that have potentially bigger promise than that, and then don't use any computing capability in comparison to actually do the proofs that you need for the blockchain to continue to evolve and to perform and validate blocks. Within our environment, we are using a consensus mechanism called DPoS, which is related to the proof of stake mechanism that basically pushes the validators to basically have a stake on the network. And the stake is in the form of coins. So if you are in a poker game and you're like, I'm all in, right? That's your stake, and you better be right, or else you lose all your chips. In this case, you probably won't lose your chips, but you lose the rewards that you would get if you were validating transactions. So that's your stake. Let's say this is my risk. So I am betting on my risk that I am going to do a good job. And if the network validates that you're not doing a good job or you're trying to subvert it, then you will be basically going to the end of the queue where it comes to getting rewards or actually getting coins. That's why you're doing your work following the rules of the blockchain. So in this context, that's much better than the alternative. But I think that is affirmation comes from a standpoint that is quite common. That there is a lot of confusion around blockchain technologies, but I don't think this is the truth today. I think most of the new projects that are good are going on the direction of DPoS or POS, proof of stake, instead of proof of work.
Thank you for answering that. Yeah, it's a very interesting concept and idea to be arguing right now. Now, you recently left a very large company involved in facility management, everything from running airports to office complexes to big buildings, you name it. What did you learn there that you're bringing with you to Naoris?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Coming from an organization with that size, that was, they had about 100,000 people globally, and it was a group of companies from many industry verticals, as you mentioned. Everything from, doing physical security, that we employed about 70,000 people doing physical security around critical infrastructure, airports, etc., or managing the facilities, so on and so forth, or even with cameras and sensors, or IoT devices in rooms and all, etc., things like that. It comes, coming from a cybersecurity perspective, you actually see that the threat landscape is very transversal. It doesn't really matter, if you are to an extent, if you are the NSA or if you are a company or if you are at home. You'll be using the same protocols, probably similar operating systems. What's mainly different is your adversaries and your budget to actually try to protect your network. But fundamental flaws that actually allow your network or your devices to be vulnerable tend to be the same, and the ecosystem from an adversary versus defender or threat actor versus defender is still the same, in the sense that the threat actor always has the advantage pretty much. So if there is a vulnerability that is unknown, it doesn't really matter if you're a nation state in essence, or if you're a company, or if you're an individual. So you should try to do, kind of like best efforts coming into cybersecurity, and that's where things like international standards for security come in, just like ISO 27001 or PCI DSS or NIST or others, which is to try to protect companies, organizations, infrastructure against more typical attacks, so kind of like best effort sort of thing, all the way to there's many actions that are needed, from setting up your antivirus correctly to having good password management, all the way to having good training of people, etc., or good encryption on devices, etc., and other policies that come into play. And obviously, coming from that environment, the other previous environments that I was in before, you see that despite we having lots of jobs or companies that weren't doing critical work for society itself, in other areas they were, but most of them they weren't. You end up being, when most companies are that actually deal with governments or have governments as clients, or critical infrastructure as clients, or highly regulated industry like banks or others as clients, you see yourself as many times kind of like a jumping board, right, between the very well backed attacker, maybe a nation state backed attacker, and their real target. But the real target tends to be a bit more well defended because they have probably a bigger budget, so they can and they will probably leverage other infrastructures as a hot point between what they are doing, their objective, and the beginning. So being very conscious about that, and having gone through various situations in my career that were quite unusual from the standpoint that the adversary was quite well backed, or had a lot of expertise in what they were doing, brings me to the point that all companies, all environments, all organizations need to be defended to a point that is, of course, both manageable from a perspective of spending, but to a point that is resilient and mature enough for them to defend themselves, not just themselves, but to their third parties as well against these sort of attacks. And the blockchain for me allows for this in a way, because it actually enables a lot of techniques to be used for defensive purposes in cybersecurity that were not really possible before, to the extent of trust and transparency that we can have on these environments, all the way from making sure that your cloud provider is doing what they say they are doing, and actually making sure that whatever breaches happened didn't start there, and validating their own work, etc., from a cryptographic perspective, based on integrity, all the way to actually making sure that the people that are accessing your systems are the ones that are accessing them, and making sure that your IP is not leaving and that it's not in the wrong machines, etc., etc. So the blockchain, it allows for, again, bringing back the ecosystem and the consensus, for this consensus to exist within a distributed environment that has no interest in, how can I say, doing anything against what it should do, because it is rewarded by a set of rules that pushes them to actually validate that there is a breach, or pushes them to validate that the system is still secure constantly, pretty much second after second after second. This is what the system and the ecosystem is made to do. So everybody actually receives, how can I say, rewards for doing this. So they have no interest in doing anything else. And suddenly what you have is an army, right, of consensus, versus a single attacker, where before what you had was a single device that was vulnerable versus a single attacker, and the attacker would pretty much win every time. Right now, you have a very different, suddenly a very different capacity to approach this. So that kind of clarity became very clear in my last positions.
Very good. So, David, talk to us about some of the other emerging technologies and their role around cybersecurity and these ecosystems. Things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation. Where do you see those things playing a part?
I think all of them have a big part to play. I think in the realm of cybersecurity, you should leverage all the advantages that you have. Your adversary tends to be many steps in front of you. It's not even fair, to tell the truth, because this has been said a million times, but it's true. You need to be one time wrong, and they just need to find that time that you're wrong. You can be a million times right, but if you're wrong once, you lose. And in normal ecosystems in companies, if somebody subverts a single server, for example, in the case of Equifax, or a single service, your company can be owned. The whole company can be owned. All identities, all IP, and without anybody even knowing about it, maybe for weeks or months, or indeed never, until they want to reveal themselves. So these technologies that you mentioned, from AI to machine learning to robotics and orchestration automation, really should be leveraged whenever possible for this, because humans, as we say, are not made to look at logs. We're not made for that. So we need to have help doing that in order to have maximum probability of success of spotting threats, even though there are so many threats constantly attacking or trying to subvert points of vulnerability in businesses constantly by the second. It's very hard to actually go and get the juice out of it, so that you go and you investigate. Those investigations take time. It's very expensive. It requires a lot of professionals from a cybersecurity perspective that these days are not easy to find. There's a huge lack of expertise in the area, or at least employable expertise. So the approach that we have, I believe, is also going to help with that, because you have an ecosystem that follows very specific rules around cybersecurity that are all working for you, right? That probably don't belong to you, but they're all working for you from an agnostic perspective, validating cybersecurity rules constantly. So probably you don't need as many investigators or cybersecurity professionals in the company compared to what you would traditionally. Once you find something, you can then go ahead and take action to fix that issue. You know, fail over that machine or turn it off, or depending on the level of criticality of it, extract logs from it and investigate, do some cyber forensics, and see what's happening. But that takes quite a lot of time. Um, uh, this environment, by using or basically by allowing, I would say in general, cybersecurity, by allowing to have to bring into their whatever technologies they are using, as a matter if it's antivirus or network security or whatever it is, bringing AI and automation orchestration, that really helps. But you traditionals still have kind of like a siloed environment, kind of like every device is still a single point of failure regardless. And if the attacker is well backed enough, or actually knows well what they are doing, it's actually quite easy to subvert those techniques, because they tend to be quite recursive. They are more evolutionary than innovative. But those innovations, I feel that they bring a lot of value to the space, of course.
Very good. So, walk me through, what your next 3 years is going to look like, David. What needs to happen to really thrive as a cybersecurity organization? Do you need to get other large networks like SAP Ariba users or banking systems? Do you need to get these other big networks to participate in order to be successful? Or can you do this as a startup, just adding one company at a time?
That's a very good question. So currently, we have already some multi-billion-dollar companies that are working with us, and we are testing our technology within their environments. And they have found that this sort of solution works very well for them, even from a perspective that is not as distributed as you would look at the blockchain being, because we're just looking at their networks together. So looking forward in the future, of course, the more environments join in, the better. So unlike traditional networks, where the more complexity you have, the harder it is for you to manage, the harder it is for you to protect, because every single one of them is a point of entry, is a point of weakness, a potential point of weakness, every single device. Uh, in this circumstance, the opposite happens. So blockchains, they thrive in complexity. So actually, the more environments come in, the more different companies come in, etc. They would be segmented into different industry verticals across the blockchain, and they would follow different standards. From a cybersecurity perspective, the rules that would be validated over time by the miners or the validators, the block creators, would be different depending on what industry vertical they are. If they were a military, they would have very different standards than if they were a chocolate factory or a mom and pop shop. So looking forward, I think the adoption of technology historically, from a mobile phone adoption curve to other adoption curves around technology, for example, the cloud adoption curve, they haven't been very slow, but we are seeing new technologies being adopted faster. And especially around the blockchain, the adoption curve is really high. It's quick. And in the cybersecurity space, being a leader that ends up advising my board on what to buy and what to get, new technologies were always on the forefront. If there was a vendor 2 years ago that was coming in with some deep learning technology that would help, for example, log management or something like that, then we would definitely look at it. It, yeah, and the same thing is true for other technologies, including this technology that, in my opinion, fundamentally changes the way that cybersecurity works potentially, because it basically allows you to flip the risk to size perspective that exists in traditional networks. So actually, the higher, the bigger, and the more third parties are part of it, so on and so forth, actually the more resilient and secure it becomes. The harder it is to compromise, in essence, um, or the harder it is to subvert the truth of that ecosystem. Especially when you look at actually doing, hashing of environments, or looking at its integrity from a perspective that is a bit more future-proof by using, for example, quantum-resistant hashes that even quantum computers would potentially have issue breaking. So the traditional hacker, and probably even the nation state backed hacker, from the perspective of actually dealing with that cryptography, they would have a much harder time, probably inflated to the size of the network compared to what you would have before. Both changing the source of truth and the status quo, the shared consensus, in order to actually have a valid, successful attack that wouldn't be caught, all the way to actually subverting machines in the way that they do today with their modus operandi that they have.
Oh, thank you very much, David, for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us. Now, Naoris, as a company, talk to us about that. At what stage are you? Are you ready? Are your doors open? Is the shingle out? Are you ready to start doing business? Or are you in early stage proof of concepts? Kind of where are you in your maturity as a company?
Right. So I think first I need to give some context around how the crypto world works, because it works a little bit differently than the traditional startup world that is not related to crypto. So because of the way that how can I say that this environment works, is very dynamic, it's very quick. Things are changing very quickly, and it's a lot about how can I say jumping into market quite hard. Most of the business, having said that, most of the businesses in this area don't necessarily have a product. They actually have an idea for a product, or an idea for an environment, or a blockchain, or a consensus mechanism, whatever it might be, or a solution. In our case, we have been working on this for about 3 years now. We have a very demoable environment. So our test net is made of hundreds of servers internationally, and they basically mimic a traditional global infrastructure, both some in the cloud, outside the cloud, on-prem, etc. All sorts of operating systems, from old OSs like HP UX or Solaris, all the way to things that people use in the office like Windows and Linux and Unix, or server-based Unix. So right now it's pretty much platform agnostic. It is tackling actually different areas of cybersecurity, both different domains of cybersecurity. Things from audit and compliance, all the way to intrusion detection and zero-day detection, and identity management and encryption and key management. So it's quite in a mature state. We have demoed this to the partners that we already have, that are quite big partners already, and they were very, very happy with what we have shown them. And right now we are going for an area where we're looking for contributions from bigger investors, because we're looking to accumulate a certain amount of both crypto and currency, so that we can actually take this to the next level, and both bring this to a more mature environment that is actually productionizable and deployable to any critical environment. And I think we are on the right path for that. We were actually recently in the Nasdaq and on the stock exchange speaking about this. So we're trying to come very hard to an environment that is traditionally more or less static, and really changing the standpoint of how we deal with these hard to deal with issues for security conscious environments. So it's in a quite mature state. I would say it's probably in a beta state.
Great. Well, David, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, sharing a fascinating topic with us, and I wish you the best of luck with Naoris. Now, why don't you spell Naoris and tell people where they can find more information on you guys?
Absolutely. So Naoris, that's Naoris, and you can go to our webpage at naoris.com. We will be soon releasing a white paper that should answer most of the questions that there are around the platform. We also have several chat rooms on different social media platforms